Good evening and welcome to this Steps Travel Instagram Live. For us at Steps, travel isn't simply about places and destinations. It's about people, about meeting people, about getting to know them better, about understanding people, about empathy. Unplanned and often unconditional moments that make connections. Trust in strangers is the very essence of travel. And it's a reaffirmation, the kindness of strangers, a reaffirmation that people are on the whole good and a reason for hope. And in our series of conversations with explorers, writers, historians and photographers, we seek to explore this further. And tonight I'm delighted to, and it's a real pleasure to have with us Leon McCarron. So let me just try and get Leon online. Hi, Leon.
Hi.
Great to have you on with us. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. So,
Pleasure.
explorer,
Yeah, happy to be
writer,
here.
broadcaster, how would you describe yourself?
Oh, I don't know. I find it hard to settle in on a term. I normally just go for writer because that's what I enjoy doing the most. Exploring, adventuring always seems it's easier to write down. I find it hard to say in real life with a straight face.
You stick
But
with writer.
so I stick with writer.
And what started you traveling in the first place? Where did it all begin for you?
I was lucky to grow up in very rural Northern Ireland on a farm, so I always enjoyed the countryside. I always felt, quite connected to wild spaces like we have up in the north of Ireland. But I didn't really leave much. I didn't travel much at all. I went to England for university, and then during that time, I kind of got a sense of the wider world. I was suddenly at university with all these people from lots of different exciting places, and had an idea that it might be interesting to see some of them. So I started planning this trip for when I finished studying, which ended up being a trip on a bicycle because it felt like a nice, slow way to immerse myself and and see lots of interesting places. And I didn't know how far I'd get, or I didn't know anything about it at all in terms of the practicalities of it. But I just set off, saved up for a year, set off from New York City, and just started riding west. And quite quickly, I realized that by traveling in that way, I would end up places that other travelers maybe didn't go, and also um, it was received maybe in a more you're more vulnerable when you travel under your own steam. So the way that I was received by people was different from if I'd been part of a group or arrived in a car or whatever. So that kind of got me thinking. I'd always wanted to write. I kind of felt like I was eh, traveling in a way that was giving me access to interesting stories, and so it turned from that journey was very much just me exploring the world, and then it turned into me wondering whether I could use this to um, to tell stories and find stories that seemed of interest. So that kind of set off years of human powered journeys of walking and traveling with horses, kayaking, and anything that helped me be more connected
And
to certain
I know
places.
that currently you're in Bristol because you're about to do a book tour. We'll talk more about that. But I understand that you or believe that you live in Kurdistan. Is that right? Iraqi Kurdistan. What drew you
I
there?
did,
I
yeah.
was lucky enough to go to there last year. I was in Erbil and further north, and I loved it. I loved the people.
Okay.
I found the scenery amazing. But what drew you there?
Um, I first went there in 2016 as a journalist, and the war was still going on at that point. And I was there, ostensibly to write about that, but I quite quickly realized that wasn't really my beat. That wasn't really what I was good at or into. And I met a young Syrian Kurdish guy called Lawi Mohammed at the time in Erbil, and he said, before I leave, I should see something different, so something other than war, something else that could be seen to define this place. So he took me off into the mountains, and they were beautiful. They were really stunning, and it was the total opposite of the hell on earth that was going on in Mosul at the time. And I I just written a book about the development of hiking trails in other parts of the Middle East, in Jordan and Sinai and Palestine, and how these trails had grown atop old pilgrimage ways, and they were a sort of exciting development in tourism and creating an opportunity in these areas. and it just occurred to me that this would be the Kurdish region of Iraq would be a wonderful place for a project like this, and no one else is going to start it. So Laween and I started it, and that was 2016. Moved there a few years later, and it's been a
And
very defining part of my life now
I read
for
last year, I think it was
7
April last
years.
year, that there was a wonderful article in the New York Times about setting up the trails, about the Zagros Mountains and doing that. So you say a bit more about the trails?
Yeah, I mean, it's really captured people's imagination. It's been really exciting. There's been a whole team of us who've been involved with it. Laween and I were there at the start, but we've had a number of other local and international colleagues who've really helped to bring it to the world. And I think so the trail itself is 220 kilometers long. It runs through the Taurus and Zagros Mountains. So, if anyone wants to look at a map of Iraq and of the Kurdish region, it's this band of mountains north of the city of Erbil, and it can run in either direction, but we primarily recommend it west to east. The 220 kilometers, 150, 60 miles is roughly 14 stages of walking, with village homestays at the start and end of each, and the local communities are a central part of it. So there's 35 or so communities that it passes through, and the guides, the homestay hosts, the other service providers are all people who live along this trail, and it's a way to walk through the history of this region and to experience not just the natural beauty of it, but also the historical diversity and variety that's been present here for many thousands of years. And so it's a really remarkable place to walk, and I see that very acutely as a foreigner. And I think one of the great things about it growing over the years has been also having so many people from here, from there. I guess I'm not there at the minute, but from the region walking it, and finding that it also helps to teach them things about their own place.
So that's walking. You talked about earlier about cycling across the US. I know you've also done journeys on sort of horseback as well. So what drew you to sort of traveling by boat, and your latest wonderful book, The Wounded Tigris? What drew you to sort of to following that river?
Well, I was living, although I was in the Kurdistan region, which is semi-autonomous, I was also, it's part of Iraq, and I'd been traveling a lot throughout the rest of Iraq. And it struck me that, everything that defined Iraq was because of this river, the Tigris, and its sister river, the Euphrates. All of the points of interest were really bound to these two rivers. And these rivers are where they're called the Cradle of Civilization for a reason. This is where our ancestors 12,000 years ago came out of the mountains, where our hiking trail goes through, and made their way down onto this vast fertile floodplain, and started to experiment with early agriculture and animal husbandry, and started to work with this river and create the first communities collected together, the first small settlements, the first cities, and so so much of what we know in society today, this is where the first written word came from, and the first sailing boats, and the first legal systems, and the first beer was brewed, and all of these things that are very important to us in life today started on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. And when I understood this, I realized that it's something that I hadn't really learned. It wasn't in my educational system, and yet it feels like such a central part to trying to understand the world that we live in. So the impetus for this journey was to both look back at what this river has the importance of this river historically, but also to look at, in a contemporary sense, what challenges it's facing now, which are
so
many.
You talked about the Euphrates as well, and sort of Mesopotamia, the land between these two rivers, as you rightly say, the cradle of civilization, and your book is a river through the cradle of civilization. Why do you think we don't know more about that? And I was lucky enough to travel in eastern Turkey last year, and sort of was it Diyarbakir, Sanilurfa, Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the oldest human temple that we know of. Why do you think that we don't know more about that in our so-called Western world?
It's hard to say, and it's hard to generalize, but I suspect a lot of it is because of the recent history of the region. We certainly, from my own personal experience and my upbringing, this was a region that was defined by layers of conflict. I'm 36, so my entire life, this region, and particularly Iraq, has been through the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf Wars, the sanctions, the 2003 invasion, the sectarian fighting, Al Qaeda, ISIS. Like it's been layer upon layer of trauma and disaster for the people who live there, and I think that has very much defined the region, and so the historical importance of it often gets forgotten. I think that's one part of it. But it's understanding it, I think, helps us understand the world we live in more, but it helps those of us who've been born and grown up in countries like the UK to perhaps to understand more some of these other places that might seem far away and foreign. And in the world we live in today, where everything and everyone can seem very divided at times, and it seems like there's division is being sowed, it's sometimes nice to be reminded of those much more intrinsic connections that we have.
I agree with that, and I think I referenced that in my introduction about the kindness of strangers, etc. And I think whilst I agree with you that some of the history has been forgotten, I think so too the people, and we get they get labelled as Iraqis, but. And you mentioned when you're setting up the trail through the Zagros Mountains, the importance of that human connection and the connection with people, meeting the local peoples. So in your travels down the river, you come across the kindness of strangers, and if so, do you want to give us some examples of that and that some of the people that you met on your travels down?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is I think anyone who's traveled in this region, this broad region, will recognize this sense of just the most incredible hospitality, particularly in Iraq. This is true, but for anyone who hasn't, it maybe comes as a little bit of a surprise. But it is something that is very much a part of life. It's a way in which people interact with each other, and it's a very genuine and holistic kindness and a welcoming of strangers. And on the river, we traveled as a small team of 5, mostly, with a couple of internationals and a couple of locals. We found that really at every turn, even in some of the most complex parts of the river, people welcomed us in. And sometimes they might be, in northern and central Iraq, it might be the sheikhs of the village or the kind of tribal leaders who would bring us in and kill a couple of hapless goats for us, and and treat us to a big banquet, which was very generous. But those tribal sheikhs very much had the means to do that. Of course, they didn't have to, but they maybe had the means. But then in the next village along, where people really had very little, and perhaps had quite often where their lives had been devastated by ISIS or by something else before, would still bring us in and give us all that they had. And so the way that we traveled was that we tried to hire local boats and local boat owners to take us, for each 2 or 3 day section until we moved into someone else's territory. And we tried to find village homes to stay in, and we never ran short of options. People would always be welcome open to welcoming us and hosting us. It's amazing to travel, for 1,200 miles through one of the most complex parts of the world, and just experience that constant goodness and kindness.
I got the sense when I was reading the book, and I think you just mentioned it, that there are different sort of sections and different maybe tribal peoples. I'm not so sure, but to what extent do they share that generosity and kindness that they showed you to each other, or are they suspicious of each other, or they just sort of exist separately?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things. It's a very good question. I think this is one of the things that is often, misunderstood, and particularly when we look at Iraq, one of the things that has been seen to define Iraq in recent years has been sectarian conflict. But this is something that really only came to the fore after 2003. It was sowed by the chaos that came after the invasion. It was not something that was very prevalent in Iraqi society before that. And so it's kind of very important to remember that that's a very recent thing. And Iraq is, historically a place of great coexistence and diversity. Lots of, many ethnicities and religious groups have lived there for thousands of years. And it's something that a friend of mine in Erbil from Mosul said to me, very early on in my experience of living there, was that he kind of got very frustrated that Western media always focused on, the war with ISIS and the recent conflict, and I think he understood that that was very important to document that and document those atrocities in the hope that we can try and avoid those happening again somehow. But he said this is not. There's a parallel force that kind of matches that, which is that for all of those atrocities, there's the opposite of the great goodness that you see and kindness that you see in Iraq as well, in this sort of small ways that I mentioned to you as well, but also in these larger ways. I mean, we met a number of people along the river who had risked their lives to save the lives of others during, let's say, the occupation of ISIS. Of one woman in a town, a woman called Qasai in a town called Al Alam just outside Tikrit, who, with her family, shepherded young army recruits fleeing ISIS across the river, risked their own lives and saved 50, 60 lives, and looked after them, hid them, and sent them on their way. And it didn't even really occur to them that the woman saving them was one sect of Islam, and then they were the other. So I think at its core, it's probably a very simple and obvious thing to say, but Iraqis as a whole are good and kind, and these divisions don't exist in that sense, but they can be exploited as they can't be anywhere. And I say this as someone from Northern Ireland who grew up in a time where we very much saw maybe not something similar, but something that had similar origins of conflict. So you can maybe just in summary, you can say you can see the best and worst of humanity in a situation like this, but it's important to also recognize that the best is there too. And
I think that's
the worst.
You said before, you've been quoted as talking about the gaps between the news cycles, and is that that's what you're referring there? These human stories that are not reported, that the media want to, I don't know, focus on the bad, on division in different ways.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time it's not that it comes from a bad place in what our media is trying to do. I think it's very important that we and the journalists who cover these conflicts are doing incredibly important work and very brave and very selfless a lot of the time. But it's I think it is also really crucial that we recognize the other forces that exist, and so the gaps between the news cycles that I've talked about is very much that, and that's the purpose of doing these long journeys of slow journalism, of being very immersed in a place, is to really highlight and bring to the fore maybe some of the more enduring and sometimes defining elements of a society or of a place. And again, just to draw on my own personal experience of growing up, I find this with Northern Ireland. When I first started traveling, people still considered Northern Ireland. I would go to other parts of the world many thousands of miles away, and people would consider Northern Ireland to be a very dangerous place, and it's because all they heard was the conflict, and so it's I understand where it comes from, but I think the more work that can be done to try and redress that balance and remind us, particularly with the incredibly fast 24-hour news cycle that we have, it's really important to reaffirm those foundations.
We talked earlier on about civilization and the history of the region. Do you want to tell us, or those listening, about some of the sites along the river that you went to, that you experienced, and the history behind them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this river is just filled with a shared, global heritage. Right from the very source. The source of the river is in southeast Turkey, just about 100 miles north of the city of Diyarbakir, and it comes out of this series of tunnels and caves, and there's a carving of an Assyrian king right above where the water escapes this cave with cuneiform writing from about 3,000 years ago, and this is when the Assyrians were one of a number of groups that were the powers in this region a few thousand years ago. And the Assyrians very much lived and had their empire along the Tigris. So the city of Nineveh, which is now inside modern day Mosul, was one of their capitals when in the 7th, 8th, 9th century BC, when the Assyrians were the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But the place that made the biggest impact on me, I think, was the site of Ashur, which was the Assyrian heartland and homeland, and the home. Yeah, and there's a a great ziggurat there, and actually in central Iraq, it's close to a city called Shirkat, not too far away from Tikrit and some of these other cities on the river. And it's you have this 4,000-year-old ziggurat, which is it's probably about 80 feet high. It would once have been at least twice as tall. It's the base of a temple to a god. It would have once been inlaid with crystal and lead, and elsewhere in the side of this ancient city are these three big broad arches of a gate over a processional way that armies would have come in and out of. And it's a faded glory, let's say. It's been exposed to the elements. The Assyrians built in mud brick, so it's suffered over the years, but it's still there and it's still remarkable. And the custodian of that site, a man called Salam Abdullah, who looks after and has looked after it through everything that's happened in Iraq, also told us that that 85 to 90% of that site is as yet unexcavated. So all of the Assyrian kings were buried in Ashur. That was the custom. So all of those graves are still under the ground, and much of Iraq is similar. So much there's never been an opportunity to do that. So think of what we might discover.
Do you think that will change? Do you think archaeologists are looking at it and now have the technology to be able to unearth some of what may or may not be there?
I think in certain areas, yes, it is happening, and certainly in the Kurdish region, there's been a lot of exciting discoveries recently. Archaeologists, like any scientist, they just need stability to be able to do their work, and Iraq has not had a lot of that. So if the country was to become more stable, there would be a lot more both local and international expeditions that would go and do that. So I think that's what.
And also Samarra, is it? Yeah, there's the mosque there. It's
a beautiful site. It's a very iconic part of Iraqi heritage. The what was once the Great Mosque of Samarra, and then the Malwiya minaret, which is this very unique design, like a snail shell design of a mosque, which stands. It's a very flat area along the river. It really is very striking. From about the 9th century and has stood ever since. Built by the Abbasids, and it's one of those things I'd seen in the research for the journey, but to see it in real life is really something else. And it reminds you that at one point, this was the center of the civilized world. This Baghdad and particularly during the Abbasid era, this was the most exciting, most innovative place in the world, and the architecture reflected that.
So the subtitle is the river journey through the Cradle of Civilization, but the title is Wounded Tigris. I love the title. Where did that come from, and was that did you think of that title at the end of the journey, halfway through the journey? What sort of brought it about for you?
I think it came about quite early. I mean, this is part of the impetus behind this journey was an investigation to ask the question, what happens if we lose one of the great rivers of civilization, and to look at the challenges that this river's facing and try and discern, are they terminal?
When you say lose it, you mean environmentally, because it's been dammed, because it's...
Yeah, because it's facing a myriad of threats. It's been dammed. It's been the governance of the river, particularly within Iraq, is really lacking. A lot of water has been wasted. The rapidly changing and warming climate is exacerbating all of these factors. The river is fragmented, and the control of the river passes through all of these different groups from source to sea. And so it very much means that this river no longer functions as it once did and as it should. So the question I wanted to ask was, what would happen if we lose that? If we lose the river's geographical functionality, but also this is a home to 20+ million people who live in the watershed of this. And I guess the title just came out of that. It's something great. It's something beautiful. It's something that's catalyzed, so much of what we recognize in life and society today. But it's also in danger. It's damaged, and it's at a point where something needs to change quite dramatically.
So
So that's probably where the title came
you
from.
said it was trying to find out various questions or looking at these questions. I was going to ask you, well, what is the answer? But I think that they need to read your book first of all before you do that. But towards the end, you're obviously in the area where again looking at the water and environmentally, the sort of where the marsh Arabs were. So the area was drained by Saddam Hussein, but has it been returned to what it was, or what's it?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the Iraqi marshes are a remarkable area, a completely unique area of biodiversity in the Middle East. There's nowhere else quite like it, and a very important habitat for fish and bird species, and quite a huge area, 1.7 thousand square miles of marshland, and this fostered a very unique life and culture that had grown, but with people who we often in English call the marsh Arabs, who for thousands of years have lived a unique way of life, with their water buffalo, fishing, building homes out of reeds, on small islands in the marshes. And Saddam Hussein drained the marshes during the Iran-Iraq War because he believed it to be a place where revolutionaries could go and hide, and he wanted to use that area as part of the front line to move his artillery across to Iran. And so the marshes almost completely disappeared at that point. And then after 2003, a number of environmentalists and environmental organizations locally began to reflood the marshes. And the marshes now, depending on the season, at most the extent is about half of what it once was. And life has come back, but it's never quite the same. You can't bring back entirely what was lost in an ecosystem like that. But it is also remarkable that it has come back to a certain degree. And of course, it's when the amount of water that flows into the marshes is higher, they do much better. A very obvious thing to say, but also given the water shortages and the challenges, further north in the headwaters, that also affects it. So life continues to a certain degree. It's not quite how it once was, and there's still hope that it could get better. But the marshes, very much like the river, are also in on a precipice.
You mentioned the word hope there. Are you optimistic? Do you have hope?
I suppose you have to. Yeah, I mean, I traveled with, particularly in Iraq, I traveled with these two young Iraqi environmentalists, Salman Kharala and Hana Ibrahim. And Salman often, always told me that you have to be, as an environmentalist in Iraq, you have to have optimism, you have to have hope, because sometimes it's all you've got. And so I really tried to take that on board. I mean, I think this journey and this book paints a pretty stark picture a lot of the time of the state of the river and the state of, the environment in general in Iraq and of the country. But there is hope. There's always hope. If things were to change, quite dramatically in the way the country was governed and the way that the river was looked after, things get better. It would take pretty dramatic shifts. But I think the other thing is that 60+% of the population of Iraq have been born since 2003. So it's a very young population, tens of millions of people who have grown up in a new generation and perhaps have the opportunity to think differently and envision and imagine and create a different country for themselves. And of course, they're working within such a broken structure already. But I think just that youth and that energy, like we saw in 2019 with the what happened in Baghdad, there is a great energy there, and so things like
which
that
is great to hear. And I love the book, and I admire you for being very. You tackle sort of head on some of the environmental problems that you just talked about, and it's in often a very stark way. But for me, the joy of the book is the eloquent voice that it gives to so many different human stories, and again, you've talked about that. But what about you? What did you personally get out of the journey with sort of either challenges that you faced, and I don't know, how did you overcome them, and how do you sort of keep going? Like, I'm sure there are lots of highs that you talked about, but occasionally there are low moments, as we know, when we travel.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's you know it's been such a great privilege to live in Iraq and in the Kurdistan region. It's somewhere so far away from where I'm from. It's somewhere that's so different in every possible sense. It's a great privilege that I have because of where I was born and the life I was born into, that I'm able to choose to go to somewhere like that, and to be so welcomed and to have the opportunity to work on these projects that I find meaningful has just been, you know, a life-changing and life-enhancing experience. Um, so I take all of that. I think the journey itself felt very important to do. It felt like somebody should tell the story of this river, and the book I want, in part to be a call to arms um, for the challenges that the river's facing. And I'm always hesitant too much to talk about this in my own experience of it, because anything I experienced or felt was is felt in many factors more by anyone who lives in Iraq and is bound to this river and this country in a way that I never will be. But it is fair to say, I mean, it was a really hard journey. It was tough. It was traumatic a lot of the time. You're hearing a lot of stories of people, multiple stories every day of people who've been through just the most devastating things. And I suppose that is part of travel. It's part of storytelling. It's part of journalism. It's part of what I do. But it was hard. It's taken a couple of years to try and process and recover from that. And part of the book was also, it's quite cathartic in a way to do that. And so it didn't stop me ever feeling very fortunate to be able to do it. It didn't stop it feeling meaningful, but it's definitely, yeah, left an impact. And I wouldn't change any of that. But you know, traveling through somewhere like Iraq inevitably and very much should have
And
that impact.
what do you say to people who are listening who sort of want to go on travel themselves, whether to Iraq or elsewhere? What's your advice to anybody traveling in general?
I think travel's wonderful. It's so hard to
Yeah.
speak about travel without falling into cliches, but that's the exciting thing about it, right? It does broaden the mind. It does. It's a wonderful way to remind you of the great beauty and variety in our world, and the fact that the majority of us who live on this planet share so much, and generally just want the same things. So I would encourage anyone who can to go and travel. And I think the slower you travel, the simpler you travel, the more immersed you are when you travel, the better it is. It's nice to have the odd luxury here and there, but ultimately travel and life is about people. It's about community. It's about connection, and the more of that you can get, the better. And if it happens to have some beautiful backdrops and nice scenery around and everything else, it's great. But yeah, I would encourage people to seek out
I totally
those
agree with all of
connections.
that about connections, and also about slow travel, the importance of slow travel, which is something that you very much do and espouse, and I think that's great. You mentioned the word luxury, so it's maybe a trite question, but what's the sort of the one luxury? What's the one thing that you always take with you on your travels?
Huh. Um, I what do I always take with me? I
Your
mean, I
Northern
at
Irish
this
sense of
point,
humour, obviously, but
there's
yeah.
very prosaic. Yeah, I worry I lost that a long time ago. Um, but I mean, when it's appropriate, let's say, I do tend to take a little hip flask of whiskey. I also have carried a tin whistle around most of the world, although it's rare that it gets brought out these days. And Yeah, that's probably it. Those are the two kind of connections back to my own culture and place. And then everything else just comes and goes. But I've always got the very prosaic, boring things like a notepad and you know, I get very, very
And
particular about those things
I'm
the
going to
more I
come to the
travel.
question about sort of where next, but before we get there, sort of how do you decide on where you're going to travel, what you're going to write about? I think obviously maybe the Tigris was born out of the fact that you were in Iraq and Kurdistan, but your previous travels, what inspired them, or was it just a chance conversation with somebody, or something that's more intrinsic to you that you wanted to go and explore in that destination or that place?
Yeah, I think it has to be something that has meaning, and that normally becomes apparent. And I suppose the more years I've been doing this, the more maybe open or aware I am of what feels like it'll be of importance. So when I first went to Iraqi Kurdistan 2016, I wasn't planning to stay there, but there was enough elements of what I experienced there as a writer and just as a traveler that it felt like it was worth sticking around or making repeat visits and eventually moving there to dig into it more. So I think these things just you get a sense of. I mean, we all have we're all individuals, we're all unique, we all have our own set of interests, our own set of skills, our own flaws and so on. And so I try and listen to those and get a sense of what would I enjoy, what would I be good at, what could I do that creates some meaning, and look at the Venn diagram of those, either in a literal or metaphorical way, and just kind of get a sense of this is somewhere I'm meant to be. There's certainly stories I've come across in other parts of the world that I think are fascinating, but I just don't feel like I'm the person to tell them, and leave those for someone else. But so how do I choose? I guess I just get a sense that it's right. It normally ticks enough boxes, and eventually, I mean, ultimately, it you can't escape it, right? I mean, with the Tigris, it just once it entered my mind, it wouldn't go away. And it's rare, I think, as a travel writer that you get a sense of a vast project and a book that hasn't been written before. And when you see
Maybe it's
that,
an
it's hard to
unfair
let it
question
go.
because I know that you're very much embroiled still with the Wounded Tigris, that you're speaking tomorrow night in Bristol at one of the Stanford lectures. Wednesday night you're in London, and then this weekend you're at the Hay Festival.
Yeah.
So please do go and see Leon at any one of those different destinations. But are you thinking what next, or are you is your mind just still on the Wounded Tigris and sort of helping to promote that and get as many people to read it as possible? As you say, you say so much in the book, but and you want to get that out. But do you allow yourself to think beyond that? Or?
Yeah, no, I do. I think at this point, this project's been going on for 4 years. I'll always be an outsider to Iraq. I won't be bound to the river in the way that my local colleagues were who traveled with me. But I have an investment in it, and I believe in the importance of the story. So I want to do justice to the story that we all collectively as a group came together to create, and that I wrote up in this book. And that means, trying to get the book into as many hands as possible, and trying to have some impact with that. And I'll probably, always be connected to that story in one way or another, whether it's in a very intensive way or whether it's, in as years pass, whether it's more sporadic. And then after that, I don't know. I mean, I'm probably at that process of there's places and ideas and the fledgling story ideas that kind of have interested me, but I am kind of waiting for something just to hook me in and see where it draws me next. But for the time being, I'm happy just to keep telling this story.
I might drop you a few ideas offline then, maybe. But
Please do.
I'd love to carry on speaking to you because I admire you so much, and I think that your book is wonderful, and I hope it gets the exposure and that it deserves. As I said, it's a very eloquent voice of so many people, and it's a very stark message about environmentally what's happening to, as you say, one of the rivers of the world. So I just want to say a huge thank you. It's been a real privilege to speak to you, Leon. Thank you very much. And for all of you, go out, buy the book, and go and listen to Leon tomorrow night, Wednesday night, or over the weekend. Leon, thank you very much indeed.
It's really kind. It's been a real pleasure.